Great. Thank you all for doing that. And it's really wonderful to see what an awesome group of environmental advocates and leaders have gathered here today to talk about this. So again, I'm Nikki Colangelo. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I work out of our Vero Beach office. It's an ecological services office. We have 3 of those in Florida. There's one in Jacksonville, another one in Panama City, and a to be determined one in Gainesville. So we're working on expanding a little bit. But I've worked for Fish and Wildlife Service now for almost 20 years and started out as a young intern up in Michigan, actually, working on shorebirds. So shorebirds are my background. And as I've advanced in my career in the Fish and Wildlife Service, I've worked on pretty much everything at this point. Fish have been the least part of my job, but this has been wonderful to learn more about the fisheries world through Dr. Gilmore. So with that, I will be talking to you about our petition process. But before I jump in, I just wanted to kind of give you guys probably all know about the Fish and Wildlife Service, but we have a lot of programs within the agency. Ecological Services is the program that I work for. So we deal primarily with endangered species under the Endangered Species Act, but we also have the National Wildlife Refuge System, fisheries offices and hatcheries. We also have a migratory birds program, law enforcement, habitat restoration. We even have a division of air quality, a tiny little division out in Colorado somewhere. So we have lots of different programs, international affairs. So we do lots of different things within the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we across these programs work together on conserving rare species and their habitats. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what is a petition under the Endangered Species Act, what are the requirements for the actual petition that needs to be submitted, how we evaluate petitions once we receive them, and then how we respond to petitions. So there's a whole process and timelines that go with all of that under the Endangered Species Act as well. So an ESA petition is under the Section 4B3 of the Endangered Species Act. And basically anybody can petition us to list a species. It can be an individual, it can be a group, it could be multiple groups coming together like this. So there's lots of different options for how to petition us to list a species. People can also petition us to delist a species. To change the classification. So if it's an endangered species and somebody thinks it's doing better, they can petition us to downlist it to threatened. Or if it's threatened and it's not doing well, it's doing worse, they can petition us to list it as endangered instead of threatened. We can also receive petitions to revise critical habitat designations. So whenever we list a species, we also look at designating critical habitat. And many of these designations are very old for a lot of these species that have been listed for a long time. And as you know, the landscape has changed a lot. So we've been getting more petitions lately to revise critical habitat to update those kinds of things. So in terms of the requirements of the petition, and I hope you all grabbed one of these copies. This is our official guidance basically on the petition process and what's required in the petitions that we receive. And it's pretty detailed. So, and I'm certainly here to answer questions, but as this moves forward, as you guys have additional questions, I'm happy to help answer and guide as well. But just some general information is included in the petitions in terms of the name and contact information of the petitioners. So if it's a group of people, we need to know, who's all included on that. The scientific and common name of each species. And we used to have multi-species petitions. We used to receive petitions for hundreds of species. And it's been very difficult for us to manage all of that workload. So our regulations changed a couple of years ago so that there can only be one species in a petition. So it doesn't mean you can't submit multiple petitions, but each one has to focus on an individual species. A clear request. So are you petitioning us to list a species, to delist, to revise critical habitat? That needs to be clear in the petition. A detailed narrative about the species, the status of the species, what kind of threats are occurring on the landscape. And then specific citations. So any citations that are in the petition, you also need to provide a copy of those citations. So that needs to come as a package so that we have all of that available to us. And then I mentioned electronic copies of the supporting materials. So anything that's referenced, data, publications, reports, personal communications, anything like that that's cited in the petition needs to be provided as a package with the petition. And also, this is really important. The Endangered Species Act defines species as species or subspecies. And this has caused some problems in the past, and there are different nomenclatures that we've been petitioned on that actually aren't considered a species under the Act. I don't think that's an issue with any of these fish, but that's just something to note, that it needs to be described whether it's a species or a subspecies. And then also the current geographic range. So that needs to be described in the petition as well. And then last but not least, and this is really, really important, we need to have documentation that the petition has been coordinated with the state agencies. So the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, they need to receive a notification at least 30 days before a petition is submitted to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and make sure that they're aware that this is something that's being submitted to us, because we coordinate with the state agency a lot. And if something gets listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act, it also then goes on the state Endangered Species Act. So they want to know, what's coming up for them to be concerned about and be watching as well. So once we receive a petition, and normally that goes through our headquarters office in Washington, D.C., and then it kind of trickles down. We have a regional office in Atlanta, and then it comes to us in the field. But we work with the regional office and the headquarters office to review the petitions that come in. And so what we're looking for is whether or not the petition presents substantial commercial and scientific information that the action that's being requested is warranted. So any scientific information that you can provide that supports the request, the more the better. And kind of the standard we use, and this is all of our legal lawyer language, but would a reasonable person who's doing an impartial review of that look at that information and say, yes, these species are warranted for listing? And then is the information that's provided in the petition, is that credible information? So is it coming from researchers? Is it published information? Those kinds of things are the things that we look at as we're reviewing the petition. So then once we kind of, that's sort of the overarching, but then there's specific things we look at when we're reviewing a petition as well. So we look at, the information on current population status and trends of a species, the factors, these are called the listing factors under the Endangered Species Act. So there's 5 of those, and I'll talk about those a little bit here in a second, that may affect the species. And those are the 5 things that we look at to determine whether or not a species should be listed. And then looking at those factors all together, and the magnitude and imminence of those factors and how they're affecting the species, and are they at a level that they're in danger of extinction or likely to be in danger of extinction in the future. The other thing we look at is the adequacy of regulatory mechanisms. So are there local laws and regulations, state laws and regulations, or other federal laws and regulations outside of the Endangered Species Act that are in place that could protect the species or the habitat? And also looking at other conservation programs and activities. So there's a lot of those things out there, but are they effective? What kinds of impacts are they having? Are they having beneficial impacts for the species? And then looking at all the relevant facts, and if there is, and this is important too, if there's any information out there that contradicts what might be in the petition, that's something important for us to know as well. This doesn't happen a lot, but it definitely happens. And we've received some petitions where we've had that kind of information. So we want to look at all of that holistically. And then I mentioned these quick definitions, what it means to be endangered and threatened. So endangered is looking at a species is in danger of extinction now, basically, or in the very near future. And then threatened is a species that's likely to be in danger of extinction in the foreseeable future. And that could be different for different species. Foreseeable future could be 10 years from now. If it's a long-lived species, it could be longer. We also look at the threats and how far out into the future, like sea level rise, for example, those kinds of things are predicted to impact the species. So it's really, is it at risk of extinction now, next year, 5 years, or is it further out, decades out? And that's kind of the difference between endangered and threatened. And I mentioned the listing factors. So these are the important things to think about when you're preparing a petition and you're talking about the threats to the species. If you can organize it under these factors, that's the perfect way to do it, because that makes it a lot easier for us to review and really see where things fall. Yeah.
Do you guys ever go through monthly, yearly, look at all the birds and animals that are not having a good time and say, hey, we need to maybe get this off the hunting list? Or you guys ever do that?
Yeah, we do. We do annual reviews of certain species that we know that we're kind of like, they may not be quite endangered or threatened yet, but they're on that kind of edge. And we do, it's called a candidate notice of review. So we review species that are at risk and, at risk of becoming, potentially listed as endangered or threatened. And we do look at those every year. It's changed over time in terms of how many we do. Honestly, it's less than it used to be because we have so many petitions for species, and I'll talk about this a little bit later. Our workload right now, we're scheduled out for the next 10 years, basically, on the number of species we've been petitioned to list. So there's a lot of workload, and trying to fit things in has been a real challenge for us, for sure.
Bird-wise rails, for instance.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well,
Hunting season, I think the bag limit is like 70.
Okay.
Every time I go, I have to see one.
Rails are very, very hard to find. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's something more that, like, if it's on a refuge, our refuges deal more with those kinds of things. The state agencies deal more with those hunting and fishing regulations than we do, unless it's on a wildlife refuge property. So the listing factors, the first one is factor A, and that's basically habitat destruction or modification. Factor B is overutilization for commercial, recreational, or scientific or educational purposes. Factor C is disease or predation. Factor D is inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. This is always an interesting one. So we really want to look at those state, local, and federal laws and regulations that are currently in place and what kind of protections do they currently provide to species and habitat. So there's a lot of state laws and local laws that protect the species themselves, protect them from collection. But when it comes to habitat, that's less common in our laws and regulations, I would say, as I've seen some of these things come through. And then the last one is other natural or man-made factors that affect these species. It's kind of a catch-all. It's a place where we talk about climate change and sea level rise, issues with getting fire on the landscape. That's a threat to a lot of our species of not having natural fires at the intervals that they need. And any other thing that would be affecting the species. So in terms of timeline in our process, once we receive a petition, technically under the Endangered Species Act, we have 90 days to respond to that petition, which is not a lot of time. And we have been not great at keeping up on that timeline historically, but we've actually done a lot of things to streamline our process. And so we are getting better at meeting those 90-day timeframes. And I mentioned this kind of already, our headquarters office usually receives the petition. They look at it, they coordinate with whoever's sending the petition if they have any questions about anything. And then they basically look to see, all right, these are Florida species, Vero Beach office, you guys need to work on this with us. And then once that comes down, that's when we start evaluating the petition and looking at the documentation that's in those petitions and really, determining whether or not we should move forward with that. And ultimately, when we make it's called a 90-day finding, and there's two options. Either the petition presents substantial information that the species is under threat and should be listed, or that it doesn't present substantial information. Either way, we publish a notice in the Federal Register documenting our decision. If we say it's not substantial, that process ends and the species doesn't get listed. If we say it's substantial, then we go into what's called a 12-month finding or 12-month status review, and then we fully evaluate all the information that's out there on a species and determine whether or not it should be listed as threatened or endangered. And so I mentioned we were not great about keeping up in the 90-day time frame, but one thing that we've done is we've started doing batched notices in the Federal Register. So as we receive a lot of petitions, we kind of put them in these different batches. And so we have 4 times a year that we're publishing our findings basically on groups of different petitions. Usually they try to keep things within the same state or region if they can, depending on how many they are. And they try to keep up on this time frame basically. So it's 4 times a year that we're publishing our findings on petitions in the Federal Register. And we always put out news releases and those kinds of things as well when we publish those findings. And I mentioned this a little bit already, but this is kind of our workflow flow chart of the process. So that, it starts at us receiving a petition. I mentioned you can do a substantial or not substantial 90-day finding. If it is substantial, then we actually do what's called a species status assessment. So it's this big report basically that looks at the species needs, what the current conditions are, and what the future conditions are. So we try to project out the impacts to the species going into the future. And again, sea level rise is one of those big components for a lot of our species in Florida, especially. So we usually incorporate sea level rise modeling into those reports. Then we have what's called a recommendation team meeting. So our leadership, like our state supervisor in Florida and our leaders in the regional office in Atlanta, they get together and review the information that's in that species status assessment and go through a process of looking at the threats and the status and make a recommendation on whether or not the species should be listed. If they recommend it should be listed, then it goes to our regional director and then to headquarters to the director, and ultimately will get published in the Federal Register. But that's this part right here. So if we say it's warranted, we do a 12-month finding and a proposed rule to list. If we do a proposed rule to list, we open it up for a 60-day public comment period. And then we have a year between the proposed rule and the final rule. So we can either determine that it should be listed and we publish a final rule a year later, or we could get new information during that public comment period that actually tells us that maybe a species is doing better than we thought, and we might withdraw a proposal. That doesn't happen very often. Usually we end up finalizing the rules and listing the species. The other option is out of this recommendation team meeting, they might say, well, the species actually is doing pretty well, we think, and it's not warranted for listing at this time. We publish that in the Federal Register and that ends the process basically. But that doesn't mean that if there's not more information in the future that shows that there are additional threats to the species, that they're doing worse, then we can go through that process again and look at the species again. The other option, which I kind of mentioned earlier, is this warranted but precluded. We call it candidate species, and they go in an annual review, and they ultimately stay on this kind of purgatory list almost in a way. that we think they should be listed, but we don't have time to review everything in the year timeframe that we're supposed to. We rarely do this anymore. For that reason, we don't want things to be in this weird purgatory and just kind of sitting there. So we usually, if we think it's warranted, we usually end up going this route of doing a proposed rule and a final rule. That's a lot, I know. The other option too is we can actually initiate our own review and go through this process as well. The problem again with that is we have had a really difficult time doing that because of the number of petition species we have. And like I mentioned, we have a work plan that goes out pretty far into the future. So it's really difficult for us to do our own reviews because we're already looking at all these other species. So ultimately, the best thing to do is to receive petitions from outside groups, and that will ensure something gets on our work plan. And that's all I've got. Questions? Yeah.
Is it up to the petitioner to propose a remediation for the species?
No.
What entity does that?
And could you
So-
repeat the questions? I'm sorry, we can't hear the questions on the Zoom call.
So the question was, is it up to the petitioner to describe remediation actions for the species? And no, it's not. You don't need to. I mean, you can if you want to. You can for sure include more information like that. But we don't really get to that part of the process until a species is listed and we start doing recovery planning. So that's the place where we start working with our partners and developing these recovery plans and figuring out what kinds of conservation actions or remediation actions we need to do. It doesn't mean that things aren't already happening or shouldn't already be happening on the ground before that plan is actually written. But it's not a requirement to include that in the petition.
Hard to get some enforcement without the standard already being met.
Yes. Yeah, Jackie.
Nikki, sometimes you say you're 10 years out or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? Does that mean something that we did was put forth to your agency, it wouldn't come into effect for 10 years minimum?
No, so we have a work plan, and I put a link here that you guys can go and see. This one I think it's for 23 through 27, and they should be publishing a new one pretty soon in a couple of months that will go out to 29. But I know internally we have things that are past 29 as well in our schedule. But it basically, that schedule is the species that we've already been petitioned to list and what year we're going to make a listing decision on. So I can't remember nationally how many we have, but like in Florida, we have almost 70 species that we still have to evaluate. That is on like this 10-year work plan, basically. And the region has many more, and nationally there's many more. But if we go through this process and determine that a species should be listed, or before we determine that it should be listed, but if we think it's substantial information, that 90-day finding, then we look at how endangered the species might be. And so we might put it on our work plan next year and move something else out further. So we do a lot of triage as we're evaluating more species and looking at the degree of potential, endangerment. And if something looks like it's, in danger of extinction sooner than something else, we'll move something up earlier and then push something out later. So there's a lot of things going on. And then also in the background, we get lawsuits a lot on, failure to meet our timelines, basically, which we should. I mean, we're doing the best that we can, but there's certain species that people do think are more endangered than others. And so we'll get lawsuits, and then we end up in negotiations with those groups and usually end up having a settlement date. So for example, the ghost orchid, which some of you probably are very familiar with, we were petitioned to list that species in 2022. We published a 90-day finding about a year later. And then we put it on our work plan for 2026, but the Center for Biological Diversity thinks that we should be reviewing it sooner. So we actually just started that review process, and we have to make a decision by June of 2025. So that's something that's always going on in the background too. And our lawyers deal with their lawyers and try to figure out those dates and look at our work plans, but things move around a lot over time. Yep. Yeah.
Does your team, review these different petitions regionally? Like your team in Florida will just review our petitions?
Correct.
Somebody-
That's correct. Yeah, we review any species that is in Florida or has its primary range in Florida. That's something that our office would be reviewing. And ultimately, you know, the regional office and headquarters would review our recommendation if it's substantial or not. But usually those don't get changed. It's pretty rare that we make a recommendation and somebody above us disagrees on that. So.
Just getting back to the rails, I don't know if you know what a rail is. Small bird, there's like 4 different types of rails. And we had like a joke here at Audubon, how somebody could actually give the go-ahead to go out and kill 50 to 70 rails a day. I mean, it's actually in a hiking guide. And I mean, it's been a joke. And I asked Bill Loftus, you might know him. He said there's more people up in the Carolinas and the rice fields. And that's really, so I thought that would be like a red light. Like, how can you kill that many species in one day when there's none around to begin with?
Right.
And I just don't get that part. I guess I need to get with you and make 4 or 5 petitions.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, I mean, that's something, if that's something that's, you know, it sounds like a major concern for some of those non-listed species. And, you know, most of those hunting regulations would be coming through the state, I think. Like I said, unless it's on wildlife refuge property, we don't regulate hunting. But, you know, that's something that we could work with the state on as well and looking at those regulations too. Yeah.
How much feedback does the petitioner get during the process about sufficiency for the detail that's required in the report?
Yeah, so if those that list of things that I mentioned, and it's listed in this document as well, if those main things are not covered, you would hear from somebody from Fish and Wildlife Service saying this information is missing. Would you please update this or send us the information? Once all of that information is provided, then you probably won't hear from us until we're getting ready to publish a decision on it. Unless as we're looking at it, we have questions or, you know, there's a study maybe that's not clear or something like that. But normally it's kind of the upfront coordination process, if anything seems to be missing. And then once it looks like we have all of those, you know, things checked off, then we do our internal thing and everything gets reviewed before it gets published. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, so I think probably a really silly question, but when I hear petition, I think signatures. And that does not play a role in this pathway or this, you know, type of petition.
Yeah, well, so the petitions that we receive, usually it is signed, and so it's usually signed by the heads of whatever organization is on the petition. But if there's a bunch of individuals, you know, anybody can sign that petition for sure.
Add any weight to it though, if this science and what your findings aren't, you know.
Yeah, I mean, technically, no, it doesn't. But I will say, I mean, when I've seen petitions and you know, there's pages of people that are signed on to it. I mean, I notice that, you know, and I pay attention to that. And so technically that's not part of our process, but it's it speaks a lot, you know, to the degree of which people are concerned about these things. Yeah.
If a multitude of different people submit a petition for one species, do you group it together and then if it's warranted, it gets grouped into one work plan?
Sometimes we do, yeah. So even though the petitions might be separate, usually if we have species that overlap geographically and have similar threats, then we try to evaluate them all together, because that certainly saves us time as well. So, and it just, I mean, it makes sense to do it that way, yeah.
Don't give up. Yeah, we've been trying to do this for a long time. What I wanted to do, I'm glad Nikki showed the pipefish, by the way. Yeah, that's a pipefish. And she had it. Okay. Okay, that's our pipefish. I thought I'd start because I've been working here a long time and trying to get people to see the fish and everything else and how it all relates. And of course, we have basically 4 counties represented here in this room right now, a lot of organizations. And the fish don't care what county they're in. They really don't. And they're in trouble out here in the lagoon. They're in trouble in the fresh water. So I want to first talk about assets that we have that are biological, things that we might not have recognized and wanted to protect in the past. Not that we didn't want to protect these fish I'm going to talk about. We have some unique creatures here. Not changing. Okay. Well, anyway, so in fact, we just heard about birds. And I wanted to talk about a lot of different things that have happened while we're trying to protect these fish, because actually it goes back 40 years or so. And then before that with some of my mentors, we're fond of fur and feathers. I mean, we have fur, right? Okay, so we protect these guys. And we protect them first. And one thing I wanted to point out too, that a lot of these animals that we do protect have fairly large geographical ranges. What I'm going to be emphasizing with these guys we want to talk about today is how limited they are and how limited their habitat is. And of course they have scales rather than feathers, but you know, they're still similar. This is Gary, by the way. He had a name. And he ate fish routinely at the Environmental Learning Center. Kids would line up and watch him ravenously just consume anything put in the aquarium. Maybe not the best one to put in a tank for people to be introduced to, but it's in our group, okay? And it's a tropical fish. You can go try to catch this over in the Caloosahatchee or the Hillsborough River and you want, but you can go out any day and collect them here in certain spots. And there are a number of fish in that category, at least 100, I guess, if you count freshwater marine estuary. And so knowing where these things are found and how unique they are to different places in Florida is really important. And this is one thing, I grew up in Sarasota and did my master's work on the Gulf Coast from Pensacola down to the Dry Tortuga. So I knew that coast before I ever came over here to Harbor Branch. And then I was startled that I didn't know the fish that were here. I think, geez, what are they? See, it's not going again for some reason or other. Tell me what you're focusing on there. The bird, right? You don't care what it's standing on. It's a worms. And those are worms that only occur here. That's a worm reef. And I have a little story with this one, the worm reef itself. There's a guy by the name of Mr. Boots who actually invented the first practical traffic light in Pennsylvania, and he lived out on the beach here. Harbor Branch just got started. We just building the building, and it's 1972. This guy comes over and he says, I have this reef in front of my house, and it's protecting my house, so how do I make this thing grow? It's coral. Well, it turned out it was a worm reef, not coral. But he gave money to support two graduate students. One was David Kirtley, and the other was Kevin Eckelbarger. David has a bench, I think, dedicated to him down at Bathtub Beach that Mark put there, and became an expert on this reef. It's our reef, and you don't see it over on the Gulf Coast. You don't see it up north of Florida, and it's really an important ecological factor here. And it's representative of what I'm going to talk about with all these other fish. By the way, try to find a hairy blenny anywhere between Florida Bay and Pensacola on the Gulf Coast of Florida. They don't occur over there, but they're all over the reefs here. And there are other scientists, Bob Gore, Liberta Scotto, who used to work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that studied that reef. And then a little bit later, Seward Johnson, who funded the Harbor Branch, started it to begin with, senior, not junior, but senior, and Jeff Prentice, subpilot, were working for Bob Avant. Well, they weren't working for him. They were just taking a ride in a submarine across the continental shelf here, doing surveys. John Reed here went over those films for a couple of years, and they ran into the Oculina Reef, discovered the Oculina Reef, okay? I think John spent the better part of his career studying that. A number of other scientists as well, Skip Hoskins, Evan, of course, Bob Jones, and we actually looked at the groupers spawning out there. Where is this found? Here. Yeah, it's one of our things. And it's protected as a result of that to a degree. Unfortunately, they still want to trawl it down. This fish was undescribed when we took this photograph. This was the bar drum. This now has a name, but it didn't have a name when we were out there. And that's a snowy grouper there, scamp, wide variety of fish use that to spawn. You won't see this fish anywhere else but out there on the Aqualand. These are amphibians. They're actually little basslets that change sex. And I won't go into any of that. But anyway, what's happened to them is the reef's turned to rubble over here by trawlers, okay? And so we have some problems with our assets here, not being protected. And a lot of this is underwater. You don't see it. That's my problem as a marine biologist. It's John's problem and others. You just don't see it. And like you focus on that bird standing on a worm reef, probably, but not the worms. Anyway, these are local, very important local assets that I think we should be proud of and emphasize, quite frankly. Now, let's see, go back to that last one. Back in 1978, right after the Endangered Species Act came out, a number of my colleagues, and I was a young buck then, so I couldn't publish. Anyway, published that, formed this committee, Florida Committee on Rare and Endangered Animals, and recommended animals for protection. And that was published by the University of Florida. When I was a little bit older, I wrote some chapters in this one. The pipefish is in this book. And this was 1992, the recommendations, of course, were the recommendations taken. And I wanted you to know some of the controversies, and we'll go through the controversies and the reason they aren't protected. And Nikki's faced some of this too, as we've been talking about these fish. We're at this point where I thought a public initiative would be best, getting people to write the petition rather than scientists. Now, I wrote and participated in the petition process with National Marine Fisheries Service because they were interested in that pipefish 24 years ago. And at that time, we thought there was some marine association. National Marine Fisheries Service does the marine side, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does the freshwater side, okay? So a fish that goes between the two is in trouble. It's like a tennis match we found. And Nikki just told me it was even more recent, yeah. But anyway, so we can solve those problems. Now we have so much information on this that whoever wants to write a petition, we have information that we've derived, the state of Florida's derived, and also information that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has derived on these animals. So who are they? Well, let's see. First of all, I want to emphasize how much data we do have. Lewis Barberry heads fisheries for Florida over in St. Petersburg for the Fish and Wildlife Service for Florida. Okay. I asked him, I said, well, how many fish collections do you make between Florida Bay and Pensacola each year? How many fish collections? He said 600,000. So you're kidding. He says, no, I have to get that number to Tallahassee each year. Before 2010, it was only 400,000 collections. So it's every 2 years, 1.2 million fish collections. That's not counting the east coast of Florida. The east coast of Florida is not as many, but that's still a lot. These fish I'm going to be talking to you about haven't been captured in that area, except for the Mountain Alafai River 3 big mouth sleepers. The guy you just saw came up 3 out of millions and millions and millions of fish collections. So we have a lot of data, and the state just gave me all that data, and it's been used to find out a little bit more about these fish. And we know a lot about the pipefish. The pipefish was first collected here by Dr. Harrington, who was in his office in the building across the street, and the South Relief Canal, and then he caught it elsewhere. So we know where this pipefish is found. We know where what it's associated with. This is another Joel Sartori photograph. This one was a female in the Smithsonian Aquarium. We released her. John released her back because we couldn't find a mate for her. They can be bred in captivity, by the way. They're doing that in Mexico because the Chinese eat that pipefish. They use it as an aphrodisiac. So it has some commercial value, believe it or not. This is a diagram I put together about 30 some years ago. When the smallest ones were found in sargassum weed. That means just 2 or 3 individuals in the Gulf of Mexico and off here. But we got hundreds in smartweed, but adults, and it's only in smartweed. The adults never out there. The nuclear power plants off Lichtenstein Island came up with 1 juvenile on the screens there. And I'm sorry I said anything about this life history strategy because that made it a marine fish forever and ever and ever and ever. Although this guy never sees salt water, the adult. And this is a collection from Sebastian River here. We see a male has a pouch. Pipefish, females give the eggs to the males to take care of. And this is, Microphis is actually the ancestor for all the Signathus, meaning the seahorses as well, were derived from this fish. This fish goes back to the Miocene. And this is it in the Smithsonian Aquarium here. So we plotted all the collections that have ever been made since 1940 in the state of Florida. And this was a plot done by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I hope he's listening. Anyway, it shows the bias towards the area where we live in. This is another way of plotting it. Eddie Perry did these plots for me, and these are the same data. It's just depicted in a different way. And what I did is I put the state of Florida over the ocean temperature there. I know we don't think about oceanography and ocean currents and everything much as humans, but that dictates everything for the fish. And if you look at that, that's a winter cold temperature shot from space of the state of Florida. Look at the blue in Florida Bay. Look at the red and yellow up where we are. That's why we have the tropical fish here. That's why the St. Lucie River is the only reasonably sized tropical river in the United States. And we're talking about distribution pattern for the country here, not just Florida. Because they aren't breeding north, they eventually will with global warming. So oceanography is very important. These ocean current patterns, particularly during the winter months, this is another winter plot here. And you see how the Gulf Stream, Florida current, really makes a difference in the reason these things are here. Not only that, but a lot of the other things we've been talking about, a lot of the other tropicals. Now, what I did is I put over that the climate, the typical climate projection that you see for plants at any garden club meeting or anything on plants, and you see how different that is. You see how you can plant that banana tree here, mango here, you can plant it over there. But there's no pipefish here, there is over here. See, you see the difference. On a very cold day, drive from here to Sarasota, my hometown, this is the difference in the temperature. Of course, that's changing. And we know that eventually these fish will end up in the St. Johns River up there. But right now, the St. Lucie River is their center of distribution. And that most of that color was on the St. Lucie River. And that is a very important river. Sebastian and Loxahatchee have these fish as well. And I thought, talking about vulnerabilities, first of all, the vulnerability that they like that warm water, and that this is the only place we're going to have that warm water. But geologically, we were different than the rest of Florida. This is a LiDAR image, by the way, in case you wonder what it is. This is LiDAR, and actually, it's showing you elevations. This is the Caloosahatchee River. This is Lake Okeechobee. And then you see the St. Lucie River right over there in Loxahatchee. The one thing I want you to know, and I always talk about this, is how that's a north-south pattern on the East Coast, where it's east-west on the West Coast of Florida.
If you are over 64, you have to watch this. I didn't know about the new.
Oh, I said something wrong. I'm over 64. Is that what she said? Yeah. Anyway. Okay. Anyway, so you have these ridges that are built up, and that's the easterly winds, and that traps fresh water. That makes a difference in these fish. It means they're trapped in fresh water over here. And what we're finding genetically, that we might even have new species out of this group. Genetically, they're separating out to a degree. And again, I've shown this over and over again. This is where we have 4 degrees rise in temperature. This would be the beach, right? This is where you want to buy your land, actually. But the ridges going back and forth there isolate. And those ridges, coastal ridges, are very evident. You know, the Barrier Island, you have the one along US 1, then you have the one along I-95. And the way the St. Lucie River used to go, of course, was mainly north and south. Same with Sebastian and the others. So they trapped these fish. The Barrier Islands didn't always open. They opened with storms. And Mr. Thurlow has a website where he shows that change taking place at St. Lucie. It's really interesting. But in the last few years, 2 books were published on fishes of Florida, and this has been my problem all along. Freshwater fishes of Florida and marine fishes of Florida. And guess what? They say the pipefish is a marine fish. So the agencies read that book and say, oh, that's NOAA, you know, not the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And it goes back and forth, back and forth. They're not marine fish. And we have the data. We have good hard data that I can give to anybody writing a petition showing that they are not marine fish. We have so much data that shouldn't have been published like that. Anyway, they're freshwater fish, and freshwater tributaries. And what's happening to our freshwater? That's why we need to pay attention to them. Now, this is a name that not only I came up with, but a Japanese scientist working with gobies over in Japan. Baculovahetus amphidromus tropical fishes. What does that mean? That means my babies can go to the ocean if they have to, and then they grow up and they come back to fresh water, but it doesn't have to happen that way.
Are there other amphidromus fish species that are listed?
Are listed? No. Not tropical.
Not tropical, but perhaps.
The Atlantic salmon, I think, is listed. Yeah. But the Atlantic salmon spends a lot of time in the ocean, comes in and goes back. These guys are really dependent on fresh water. No fresh water, you won't have these fish. No tropical fresh water, you won't have these fish. So I emphasize tropical. We should always use that with these guys. Facultative amphidromus tropical fishes. And we think their strategy, all of them, seem to occur together around lagoons. Cordillera Lagoon, Laguna Madre. Okay, you're back there for years. What are you going to do? You got to reproduce, so you reproduce. A hurricane comes through, bam, washes everybody out to sea. The adults don't survive, but the young do. Find fresh water someplace else and take over the planet Earth. I mean, everybody wants to take over the planet Earth, but they're having a hard time. And so the sleepers sleep during the day. They're awake at night. They crawl up people's yards and eat small dogs at night. That's the spiny cheeks. There are two species of those, and no one wants to put this in the aquarium anymore because they eat everything. But there are a lot of gobies in this group. This one, the old timers in Stewart called this the dog-faced eel. It's not an eel; it's a goby. It's one of the longest. It is the longest goby on the planet, and it lives in soft sediments downstream around Palm City up to Prima Vista Boulevard. And it does well in an aquarium, and it actually is kind of an interesting fish to look at. If you look carefully, where the little red arrows point to those coming up into Phil Tafoya's yard, when Irma went by, there was a low dissolved oxygen level in the St. Lucie River, and these things started going into people's lawns by the hundreds. So we know that they're there. But you have to get a trawl, go in the mud to collect them. And there are a host of other gobies here. This photograph was taken by Mike Milbrook with St. Lucie County. Again, I think the same storm. Irma had flooded over Gordy Road, the locks, and they were taking advantage of that. They're on their way upstream. This is a river goby. And so long as it's warm up there, they'll stay up there. Now we know the pipefish is actually reproducing. And Lake Okeechobee, the first ones were collected in 2013 by South Florida Water Management District biologists. And then recently, there's another young man who's been collecting them in the Kissimmee River, in the mouth of the Kissimmee River. So they made it from the St. Lucie through the C-44. And we have over the years collections for C-44. So it's migrated that way. I think the pipefish, I mean, we could talk about gobies, and I thought gobies are great for aquaria. Introducing the public to these fish would be with gobies. The pipefish possibly too, but the pipefish, we've got to limit to one fish. Of course, we could do one per group, right? But if we have to limit it to one fish, the pipefish should probably be the poster child to begin with. But we do have 3 species of snook we want to list as well. 5 species of snook here. Sword spine is the smallest one. By the way, it's also the ancestor to all the other snook, the sword spine is. And then we have 2 fat snooks. And the Oxbow Aquarium, I think, had that fish there. It was photographed. Okay, there's a white-mouthed croaker, which everybody eats and thinks is a croaker, but it's not our common croaker. And then we have a mullet, mountain mullet. Well, what's a mountain mullet doing in Florida? I mean, you know. Well, every once in a while you open the locks, there's a waterfall, you know. But anyway, the mountain mullet is reproducing here, and it's in the same group. There are 16 species altogether in this group, fishes, and if you go to Costa Rica, you see them there as well. This brings up the fact that this seagrass was just delisted, Johnson seagrass, and it was delisted because it was synonymized with a species that's found in the Pacific and Africa, Halophila ovalis. It wasn't Halophila Johnson. It was described when I was at Harbor Branch, named after the founder of Harbor Branch, Johnson. I mean, we still call it Johnson seagrass, but it's been delisted. And so I started asking around, and I'm still asking around on who wanted to do this. And Bob Bernstein and I had a conversation last night. The green turtle is still endangered. That's the global range of the green turtle everywhere. But it's still endangered. Here's Johnson seagrass, mainly the tropics. You can see very similar range, but it's mainly tropical. But it's delisted. So someone's going to say, well, the pipefish does that occur in the Pacific Ocean or someplace else where you have a separate subspecies here? And of course, we're talking about freshwater now. We're talking about a little freshwater river. And the genetics is showing that there is some separation so far, that we have our own Indian River Lagoon population. Genetics is still being worked out, still being done, both by Iris Seguro Garcia at FAU and also Jeff Ebley, who's now with Hub SeaWorld. Now, I am showing these slides, this closing, you know, what are you going to do? And I think there are a lot of things that can be done in restoring habitat. And actually, I went into habitat in St. Lucie County, restored a few months ago. Beautiful vegetation. There's everything a pipefish should ever want. But the fish weren't there. And I think it was because of clean water. So we need to look at the water and what's in the water and then clean it up. And I showed this slide because people still don't believe me, but I used to snorkel down the St. Lucie River and count the fish. What? No, and I didn't die. It's clear. Same thing with Sebastian River. I used to snorkel down the Sebastian River and count the fish. I think we have some underwater photographs. This was back in the 70s, of course. And there are still some living witnesses to that. So we got to get back to that. We got to get back to that and restore it. That's all I had. Thank you. Did everybody get a list of the fish with the emailings? 16, yeah. And I want you to know that there's an abundance of data on a number of these fish. It's been taken over the years. We know how they reproduce, how many eggs they have, fecundity. We have some idea of what might eat them, what their mortality might be like in certain cases. There's some that we don't know much about. But I'm willing to give data to whoever wants to step forward and pursue this. And I'll just be a source of information. And maybe contacts as well. So, anybody like to pursue this?
So what is that process? Would each group would have their own petition, or would there be a central petition and everybody would kind of sign on to it, or maybe describe their specific location?
Well, until she said you could only do one species, I was thinking everybody getting together. Now I said, oh, you do the Goby, you do whatever. But they're all related. Whatever Nikki thinks would be the strongest way to go with it.
Would the strategy be to have each group have a species that they would champion?
Could be, yeah.
You could do that, and then you could have everybody else sign on. Take the lead on writing the petition for a particular species, but everybody else could sign on to that.
Is it not true that the petitions for each species have already been written? So that we would be rewriting that petition.
To a degree, when I was working with Martin County, they asked me what the threats were, you know, the last report I gave. And so we enumerated the threats. And that's one thing that you really have to, you know, what is the problem here? And we know that some of the places we documented years ago where we were catching these fish, that they aren't there now. And there's an effort now to go back and collect at a number of these locations, thanks to John Galvez and his group. And the state is still collecting. So we have, they're all in the same group. In fact, when you go out to collect, you invariably get 4 or 5 of different species at the same time. So it would be so unusual to say, okay, this fish is doing this, but the other fish is doing the same thing, you know? And even the seasonal pattern seems to be very similar, the way we're getting them. And we think they've been doing this together for a long, long time, quite frankly, because when you go to Costa Rica, you see them, and that's a different subspecies, you see these guys together down there. And ironically, as the genetics has been done, they all go back to the Eocene and the Miocene together. So they've been hanging out together for a long time. It's just that when they got to East Florida, they didn't know what herbicides or any of this other stuff was. It's something new, you know? So we got to think about water quality if we want them. That's good. Mark?
Hey, Brad, you evaluated, or could you evaluate the 16 different species and saying which one should prioritize, which one should be the top of the list because of whether they're sort of threats that are that species are driven versus other ones, and also if you were able to get that one listed, it most likely would help the other.
Good question, Mark. And I don't know why this happened. Is when you pull up a net, you know, and the puffer shows up, you know, everybody goes, oh, you know, they flock around the puffer. Well, she just showed the pipefish. Okay. And Noah wanted me to do the pipefish. I said, well, you know, there's other guys, you know, you don't like the big mouth sleeper? Oh, he's ugly, you know. But, and there are people going to jump on the snook too, you know. And so I thought, well, if we had to pick one, she already picked it. She had it on her slide. The pipefish would be a good candidate. And the pipefish can be bred in aquaria. We know that. If somebody wants to try to tackle something like that. And introduced to the public. Because I think it's important. Nobody sees these fish. I've been showing photographs for a long time, but nobody sees them. They aren't like the birds and the manatees and the sea turtles. So it'd be nice if the public was introduced to them. They saw them on a routine basis and knew that this was our guy, gal, only in the St. Lucie River, Loxahatchee, and Sebastian. No place else, you know. So.
It's the most reflective of water quality issues. Because to a certain extent, we're utilizing this as a tool to get better habitat.
Mm-hmm.
You know, sort of across the Blackwater
Mm-hmm.
system as well.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the ideal fish to use? Or would an assemblage work better?
Well, assemblage I think would work better, but they all live in the same poor water quality. They have different habitat. Of course, the pipefish likes the grass along the banks, which are routinely herbicided. The big mouth sleeper likes to hide under the banks and nail other fish that go by. So he's a little different. The long, skinny violet goby digs in the muds. He's got to have some mud somewhere. So they all have different habitat requirements, but they all die if the water quality is bad.
You see the velvet eel dying in muck closets. Do they move if muck overtops them?
Yeah, well, muck meaning soft sediments.
Yeah.
There's some fish that depend on soft sediments.
Yeah,
They're one of them. In fact, the next largest collections are coming from the St. Johns River trawls. You have to trawl, and not many people trawl, and because you're dragging a net down in the deeper water in the bottom. That's where they're coming up. So the largest population of that goby, the violet goby, is in the San Lucie River and the mouth of the St. Johns River. It does well in Aquaria too.
Okay, so looks like all 16 species here live within the St. Lucie River.
Yes.
How important do you think the oxbows, the natural oxbows of the river are, as habitat for these species compared to the
Channel.
good?
Well, we had some data on that actually. when Jeff Beal used to routinely go down the St. Lucie River, and we also had the state guys in shock. When they went into an oxbow, you got the big mouth sleeper and some of these other, the smaller snooks. And the oxbow, when we went out in the river channel, we got grass carp and a number of other exotic species. And snook were everywhere. The common snook was everywhere, basically. But these smaller snook like to hide in the oxbow back in those areas. So I think the oxbows are very important. And that was the natural river channel at one time. And we've been looking at the Becker House oxbow, which St. Lucie County restored. And it's beautifully revegetated, but for some reason or other, the fish aren't there. And I think it's water quality. It's got to be water quality. I mean, because it really looks nice. I mean, if I was a fish, I'd go there, but you know, something else is happening there.
So is there ever a thought, you know how SWC was able to create critical wildlife areas of spoil islands in Martin County? Has that ever been discussed? I feel like I hear this, I don't know much about St. Lucie River, but every time like when I hear about oxbows, crawfish, these species, especially all these endangered fish, you see oxbows. Is it possible to get them listed as critical wildlife areas? What would that take? I know that's a state listed, I believe, right? Is that ever thought of or discussed? I mean, wouldn't that protect the whole?
Well, that actually brings up the coordination between the state and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And I spoke last year with a habitat restoration group with the state of Florida. And I think this whole effort needs to be coordinated with the state agencies for habitat restoration. And quite frankly, habitat restoration and water quality should be number one. And this will not only bring these guys back, but also a lot of our fishery species. They use the same water. And so I personally think that what you're suggesting should be done. By the way, not to do away with canals, because South Relief Canal is where we caught a lot of these guys. And then the River County has these 3 canals. Well, those 3 canals are on old natural creek beds. They're names that could be other than canal. The fish looks at that, well, it's straighter than it was before, but it still has water, okay? And they're going up there. And so they're using the canals as well. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is planning on surveying all the canals in Indian River County, I think. And I think it's going to be surprising how many canals actually are used as fish habitat, including these guys, and their role. I don't think, in fact, when I talked to the state habitat restoration guy in Tallahassee, he said, "Oh, we don't like canals. We don't even think about canals." 2 weeks later, he wrote me back. So, "Oh, we had a meeting. We decided we're going to include canals." I said, "How many canals are there in South Florida? You got to count them all off? You know, come on." And so canals are extremely important. And where there's water, there's fish.
The species for the St. Sebastian River, if we were to adopt a specific species to address?
Which one do you like, Tim?
It's your preference. Is there one that would be maybe more critical or more widespread, that it would be more, you know, in other words, if we protected one, it would impact all the rest? I guess that would be true for all of them.
There was a hot spot in the Sebastian River, you know, I've been talking about below the Fellsmere, and everything was there. It was just amazing place. It had all the habitats and it had all the fish. There's nothing there. The last time we were there with John, we couldn't get anything. And
Cordgrass is critical. Cordgrass is critical.
not cordgrass, smartweed. Yeah, and but there was a sand bottom there that was nice until something happened upstream. Maybe Edie Witter could tell us what happened upstream. But all of a sudden, we had this growth of cyanobacteria on the bottom, and a lot of other things happening there that the fish didn't like. I mean, they weren't there. And I don't know whether they've come back. I haven't been up there recently. But that spot, the one that we collected most of, the largest collection was the pipefish at that location. So that was a great place for the pipefish. Mark?
Perhaps for maybe helping, the idea that, there's a lot of state agencies that already have, North Fork Aquatic Preserve, Indian River Lagoon Aquatic Preserve, Santa Florida Waters, even part of the Indian River Lagoon was NOAA's, critical fish habitat designation. But with all those designations and even 33 threatened and endangered species listed in these water bodies, what happens? I mean, even if you list more species, it's not going to, how do you help the ones that are listed? I mean, you got listed species in these waters that are highly polluted, that are being polluted all the time. What does Fish and Wildlife or other agencies do to respond to these impacts? I know the process goes through recovery. Okay, so you list species, now you come to the recovery plan, and it's supposed to help. Okay, how do we get the species to not go extinct? How do we get it to recover? And I guess in general, but it seems like, you've got listed species already. Are they being protected? And that's kind of going to the question about, if we go to all this trouble and get these particular fish listed, what's their demise going to happen in the water? Does Fish and Wildlife address this when we do have pollution or impacts to water bodies that have listed species? What's the response to Fish and Wildlife?
Yeah, so I mean,
Nikki, I'm sorry, let me just use the mic so that we can get it on.
Yeah.
No, that's okay, it's just so that we can.
Yeah, sure. No, it's all good. No, that's a really great question. And it's a huge challenge for us. Because we write these recovery plans and, we list all these things that need to happen and how much it costs. I mean, at the end of the day, it comes down to funding, which we don't have a lot of. I mean, as individual groups and agencies, that's a big challenge for us. And we have less and less as we list more and more species. So we're trying to do these sort of landscape level ecosystem approaches with recovery planning, which we haven't traditionally done in the Fish and Wildlife Service because we list by species, right? We can't list a habitat or a water body under the Endangered Species Act, but we're trying to do a more holistic recovery planning type of thing. So I would see that kind of approach as a much better approach for something like this. But, when it comes to pollution and impacts, that are causing the pollution, I mean, that's not something that we have jurisdiction over, right? So that's where we start thinking about all the partners that can help us and what other agencies can help us and potentially other laws and regulations. And that goes back to that, lack of regulatory mechanisms to address some of those things. So, it's a true partnership when it comes to recovering a species. I mean, each agency can't do it alone. The state can't do it alone. Federal agencies, counties, so we all need to work together and doing more things like this too, which we haven't always done for our our non-charismatic species. That's something that we need to be doing more of too.
Mark, that's a really good question, and that's why you're here. Quite frankly, I've been working with the agencies for a long, long time, and I have students who've gone to them too and have been frustrated. But I think public support and political support is the only way to go, and that really changes a lot of things. If you have elected officials that are sensitive to all this stuff too, and St. Lucie County has been putting the oxbows back into play, things like that. Okay, and if a kid can take gobies home, as a pet, they get to know a goby, then you can't do that with manatees. You can't do that with sea turtles, right? Yeah. Hey, if we list them, can the kids still take them home? Okay. No. Okay, well.
Wasn't there South Florida management plans or whatever, and that attacking the system? whatever way you want to put it, and we had all of the listed species. So if anything was to be done in that region, you had consulted, and you look for all those listed species, and you look for the habitat, and then there was a central, and that was, wasn't that administered by Fish and Wildlife?
Yeah.
So is that a possibility for a situation like this, where there are obviously a number of species?
And is it easier for your agency to manage something under federal mandate rather than state mandate?
Absolutely.
So if it was designated perhaps national park as opposed to a state reserve, perhaps you have more authority to protect that species within that reserve.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, and quite honestly, when it's, I mean, it all comes down to funding at the end of the day, and we are focused more on species that are already listed. We have more funding opportunities that are listed. We're trying to work on some of these at-risk species, but ultimately, you know, the priority of the trust. If you guys move forward with this, you know, this is something that potentially, you know, if they get listed or any of them get listed, could provide some more funding.
Donna, will everybody have ability to communicate with everybody else who's here today?
If that's what everybody would like to do, I did write on there that if they wanted to, want further information, to put a check mark.
And of course, if they want to coordinate doing
Yes,
something.
they want-
Sherry?
Fran, just to clarify about your original vision of protecting these species, and you see it as more of a public, getting the, you know, the species awareness out for the public. But do you see, is there certain strengths you see to the public doing this as opposed to you as a scientist doing it?
Yes, because I've been trying for a long time. You know, well, there's scientists out there that don't know these fish. I'm like a lone voice in the wilderness, you know. In fact, we had a newspaper reporter, Tyler Treadway, that wrote an article on these fish. Well, as a scientist in Gainesville that climbed down, I got all over him. He said, those are rare. They aren't reproducing in Florida. What are you talking about? And so that was Gainesville. I mean, same state. So I think if we had a lot of people involved, besides me, it would be nice, you know, and the advocacy, I mean, like you do for right whales. I just had to mention right whales.
If I may, suggest a consideration, really good to do some kind of research into other communities that have been successful. And it may be only listing individual species, but also in the recovery or restoration program. I happened to see, and I don't remember how I came across it, was Crystal River. And I'm not sure of the different agencies that they got involved, but it was a community effort. So it might be that it's a good thing to tell a story, to get people involved, and then also for them to see that there's these incredible species, but also that if we help them, we'll be helping, you know, the water quality, biodiversity, et cetera. So I'm just trying to see, so I get clear on your vision.
Yeah, and you write, you've written some books, and you know, writing and getting stuff out there will help, and I think we do need that. The poor newspaper reporter wrote a great article, but they climbed down his road. He never wrote another one on these guys. But these are real interesting fish. They each have a story. I mean, the pipefish, I had a graduate student who raised them in her dorm room, and they did a little dance, and they produced sound, by the way, lip-clicking sound. And then the female transfers the eggs to the pouch. And she'll do that 2 or 3 times. So she's got 700, 800 eggs in there, more eggs than any other pipefish. And of course, there's interesting things about all the fish, the gobies too. The gobies are really smart, by the way. The brain is that big, but they're really intelligent. They conditioned right away, and they have a social hierarchy and all kinds of things.